Will the Russian-Ukrainian war stop this year? What ultimatum will Donald Trump issue to Putin? And what awaits Russia after the end of the so-called SMO? We'll talk about this and more right now in our broadcast. My name is Anastasia Noritsyna, and Garry Kasparov, world chess champion, is joining us. Garry, it's a great pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you. Well, a former world champion, to be precise. Let's stick to the historical truth. Right now I am playing a different game altogether, not chess at all.
It's true. And we'll talk about what awaits the whole world, what awaits Ukraine, and what awaits Russia. Let us start our broadcast with the fact that the last time we spoke was almost exactly a year ago, when Donald Trump had just won the election. How would you describe this first year in office of the 47th President of the US?
If I had to choose only one word, I would say chaotic. Nothing else should have been expected. I think that it's for sure a major test for American democracy. I hope it will withstand it. And Trump's presidency is marked, of course, by unprecedented corruption. Moreover, unlike some similar events in the past, although, of course, on a smaller scale, now it has become completely open. He considers it unnecessary to be ashamed of his actions at all. Moreover, I can say that many actions of this administration run counter to American democratic traditions. But, unfortunately, this did not happen out of nowhere. I believe that these abuses of the Donald Trump administration were largely prepared in advance. The basis had already been prepared by the Democrats, starting with Barack Obama and, naturally, Joe Biden. In my view, Joe Biden's administration was disastrous for America, both in foreign and domestic policy. It created the situation in which radicalization of society and the strengthening of the most aggressive elements on both the right and the left of the political spectrum made it possible for Donald Trump to become president, who can run counter, a president whose actions almost always go against traditional democratic norms. In foreign policy, Donald Trump again places his own interests above everything else. And at the same time, probably, in some cases, these interests coincide with the interests of the Americans, America, the interests of the free world, but not always. So, we can confidently say that while President Donald Trump will remain in the White House, according to the Constitution, he will have to remain there for another 3 years. Although, looking at, let's put it this way, obviously, it seems to me that Trump's moral and psychological state deteriorates, and everything can happen earlier. But in general, we proceed from the fact that for another 3 years there will be such a constant shaking, as if the plane got into a zone of turbulence, and a very strong one, and there is no end to this in sight. Accordingly, this will also affect all international events, because President Donald Trump's actions will undermine the already worn-out system of international relations as much as possible. On the other hand, that system has already outlived its usefulness. And therefore, probably, such a bulldozer that will destroy all this, is necessary for something new to appear in its place.
I want to ask our viewers to leave your comments under this video as well. How do you describe this year of Donald Trump's presidency? Don't forget to also like this video, and, of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Garry, during the campaign Donald Trump promised to end the war in 24 hours. We all remember this. Then he said it would take a couple of months, 2 or 3 weeks, and now he says the war will end soon. He said this just recently in an interview with GB News. Can we hope that common sense will prevail in American foreign policy? And can we expect real actions from Donald Trump towards Russia, real pressure on it?
And what Trump says must always be divided by 10 or by 100. It is clear that he can say anything. He believes he has the right to say whatever is beneficial to him at this particular moment. And there's no guarantee that an hour later, or even 30 minutes later, This thought, this idea, this proposal will still seem right to him. President Donald Trump constantly changes his mind like he changes socks. It is clear that statements such as "I'll end the war in 24 hours" or "I'll end the war in a month" have nothing to do with reality, but he wasn't bothered by that. It was advantageous for him to say it, and he said it. Trump's actions in relation to Russia once again show that, of course, he will not exert any real pressure on Putin. Yes, there are some actions that help Ukraine. Trump is forced to act not in a vacuum. In his administration, and in America as a whole, anti-Putin and anti-Russian sentiments are quite strong. President Donald Trump has always been very sensitive to how voters react to his actions, especially his base. Right now, even within his base, his mega base, among his pro-Trump supporters in the Republican Party, the share of people who want or consider it necessary to support Ukraine is still quite large. It is critically above 50%, so in general Trump is forced to maneuver. On the one hand, he has an attraction to dictators and an obvious psychological dependence on Putin. Let's not speculate here about the reasons. And on the other hand, he faces such voter demands and pressure within his own administration. People may not directly criticize Trump, but, nevertheless, the behind-the-scenes struggle is still going on. And this is due to the fact that some of Donald Trump's actions still contribute to an increase in pressure on Russia. But the arsenal of instruments Trump has at his disposal has not even come close to being fully used, and will not be fully used. I do not yet see any indicators that Donald Trump will abruptly change his position in relation to Putin. He constantly gives Putin, if not a carte blanche, then a certain amount of trust in what he says, even though Putin lies all the time. And Donald Trump is probably beginning to understand that the war cannot simply end because he says so. But I don't think we will see any decisive steps from President Donald Trump that could dramatically shift the situation. Let's put it this way. Even the story with the tomahawks that were supposedly going to be supplied. And Trump, as always, lied, saying that we have a deficit. The Pentagon has already denied this. And President Donald Trump does anything in Ukraine's favor only under pressure of overwhelming circumstances, when he has to make some gesture to public opinion and maintain a balance within his own administration. But these are very gradual steps. If we recall the actions of the Biden administration, there was also something to find fault with. But we are talking specifically about Trump now, and again, I would not have pinned any special hopes on him in this matter.
And by the way, what do you think of Trump's initiative that NATO countries should buy weapons from Washington so that America does not spend $1 to help Ukraine? How does it work in general, and how do Americans feel about it?
Trump wants to make money on everything. He portrays himself as someone who defends American interests, although his tariff policy hits ordinary Americans very hard. It is clear that he is only interested in himself, his family and, perhaps, his inner circle. And as for these proposals, or rather Donald Trump's demands to buy American weapons, this is happening anyway due to the fact that the Americans simply have a better developed industry. But Europe is also building its own industry. For some time, of course, purchases from the United States will continue. However, the solution is not to buy from Americans, but to build Europe's own military-industrial infrastructure. Europe is late, of course, and we can also devote a separate topic to the European bureaucracy and the unwillingness of key European countries and their leaders to recognize reality, that the war in Ukraine is not merely President Vladimir Putin's first step, but one of his early steps toward changing the entire geopolitical balance both in Europe and in the whole world. And, therefore, the purchase of weapons in America is now necessary. And Europe needs to find money. That's the next question. How will Europe pay for this? But the cardinal solution is, of course, to build their own military industry. And in principle, Europe is moving in that direction. The war drags on. In fact, Ukraine bears the hardships of the war, pays with people's lives, and with enormous suffering. But Europe is slowly starting to realize that this is not Ukraine's war, not even a purely Eastern European war. It is a war of the whole world of totalitarianism and world of tyranny against the world of freedom.
I think that Europe is just getting ready, because the German Minister of Defense Pistorius said that perhaps last summer was the last peaceful summer for Europe. He says that Russia may attack NATO in the coming years. We have always said that this could happen in 2029 or 2030. However, now there are others who say that it could happen as early as 2028. And some military historians even believe that we spent the last summer in peace. Is Europe ready for the fact that Putin will be able to launch aggression against the countries of the alliance? Or do they still live in these illusions that Putin is not ready for this?
We need to clarify what we mean by readiness. What level of readiness are you talking about? Is Europe militarily ready? In principle, yes. Europe has all the resources. In order to be fully prepared and armed, and kind of entrenched, in general, in order to resist Putin. It seems to me that this is not a military question. It's not an economic question either. Europe has the resources. It's a psychological question, because war means shooting, and when there is shooting, people get killed. European politicians are not ready for a war in which citizens of their own countries start dying. Probably Finland is ready. So, if you look, there is an absolute degree of readiness in Finland. Of course, the Baltic countries are forced to be ready. I'm not sure about the exact level of their readiness. There are different groups in the population, but overall they just realize the fact that they will be on the front line. And Poland is now probably starting to prepare for this psychologically as well. At least, we hear quite clear statements by Polish politicians and the Polish leadership. As for Germany, I was recently in Berlin, and it is clear that there is no level of readiness for war. What Pistorius said, they will attack somewhere else. One of the problems is that war is fought not only at the front line, sometimes missiles fly. And the very idea that some Russian missile can fly to Berlin or to some other German city, it is simply terrifying, because no one is ready for this. The entire concept of Europe in the days of Angela Merkel was built on the assumption that you should trade with Russia, build good relations. And it's clear that Putin will never destroy business. Europe is fundamentally unprepared for armed conflict. Again, if we compare military economic potential, then there can be no comparison at all. The combined armed forces of northeastern Europe alone, together with Ukraine, would be enough to deliver a decisive defeat to Putin. We are talking about the 3 Baltic countries, no matter how small they are, but I think they will scrape together more than 200,000 people. Even if you look at what they have at their disposal, I think they will mobilize 150 to 200,000. The Finns have a lot to mobilize. They could mobilize almost the entire country. The Finns are really ready. Poland has a 500,000 army. There is also, if you look at the border with Russia, Romania to the south. In general, even if you look at this northeastern bloc, Sweden is also a NATO member, and this is more than enough. In a few hours, the Finns and Estonians would destroy the Baltic fleet. I mean, if a war breaks out, yes, war is war, but you just need to understand that you will have to shoot for real. And the tragedy is that the West cannot decide for itself that it will fight for real in this war. And fighting for real does not mean only defending against a border incursion, it means striking military targets located on Russian territory. Ukraine is still forced to make do with its own resources. Another thing is that it hits the Russian military and oil infrastructure very effectively. But it is obvious that the West could do much more, give Ukraine more weapons so that infrastructure and, for example, airfields that could be used to attack Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Poland could be destroyed. But that requires decisive action, and decisive action is not achieved by consensus. The The European Union works by consensus, NATO works by consensus. Considering the fact that America now takes a rather neutral position in this game and no one wants to rely on American guarantees that under Trump are unlikely to be fulfilled, we end up with a situation in which Europe is hoping that, once armed and entrenched, it will be able to avoid a direct clash. So European politicians still plan to avoid clashes. Everyone just needs to understand that even today, if Europe had military political leadership ready to fight back, and President Vladimir Putin understood that, there would be no war at all. What kind of war can there be? You can just compare resources. It is clear that Finnish artillery could demolish half of St. Petersburg if necessary. Swedish aviation, the huge Polish army, and this is all in a situation where Ukraine is fighting and fighting very effectively, that makes the resources of the sides completely incomparable. But in war, the psychological factor is critical. Putin is ready to fight, throw hundreds of thousands of soldiers to certain death, and Europe is not ready to sacrifice anything there. So Europe still lives in peacetime, even in countries that are located very close to the conflict zone. So we know that Ukraine is under constant pressure from bombardments almost every night and often even in the daytime too. Everyone sees it, but for some reason they believe that this is another world. It's some kind of an astonishing psychological detachment when people talk about the war happening in Ukraine as about something happening somewhere else, in another dimension. It's not even so far from Berlin, where I was. What is the distance from Berlin to the front line? 1,500 kilometers, no more. This is very, very close by today's standards. There are missiles and drones flying at such a distance. Moreover, although they do not say that these are Putin's drones, but of course some unknown drones regularly paralyze the work of large European airports. We are talking about cities like Munich, Brussels. They are constantly coming. Copenhagen. And Europe is still not ready to fight back. It is still looking for some option to end the war. But, as they say, on favorable terms. We still haven't really heard the words. Ukraine must win, Putin's Russia must be defeated on the battlefield in order to pull out the poisonous tooth from the dragon. This thought only appears on the periphery, occasionally it is voiced here and there. But there is no categorical demand to mobilize the resources of Europe, NATO, and as far as possible the United States, though with Trump it will be very hard, to deliver a decisive defeat to the aggressor and strip him of the ability to threaten others. In the meantime, we do not see this yet.
Europe is currently pretending that nothing is happening. You mentioned the story with the drones. And today we also saw the story that happened in Poland, where a railway line carrying aid to Ukraine was blown up. And they also say there. We can't say yet that this is Russia. Of course, there is an investigation and everything else. But it seems to me that this is threat in a hybrid war, it will only grow. And what about Europe? Are they still counting on Trump ending this war, and that they'll live peacefully and quietly?
I'd say that we have a situation in which we can see a kind of expanding cognitive dissonance. There is an understanding that the war is coming, but I want to believe that it will not happen. So it seems to me that this is such a strange situation, when there is a rejection of reality, because reality is terrible, in fact. And I already said, European politicians have formulated for themselves the concept that they need to strengthen their defense, they need to prepare, they need, of course, to help Ukraine in order to avoid a war with Russia. Pistorius said today for the first time that the war is very close. They understand it. But so far no one is ready to stand up and tell the citizens of their country, we need to prepare for war. After all, if you look at the level of readiness of countries psychologically, how many people are ready to fight? Fight for their country. In Finland that level is 80%, everything is clear there. But in Germany it is 16%. In Italy, I think, 14%, the lowest one. I mean desire to fight. because to fight is to take a risk. And moreover, today the risk is not only at the front line, you need to have air defenses, you need to have bomb shelters. None of that exists. Nobody has built it. All these years, Europe lived under the American umbrella and traded with Putin, assuming that as long as business continued, nothing bad would happen. And again, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, President Vladimir Putin's attack, this is a full-scale one. It began almost 4 years ago. Almost 4 years ago. It'll soon be 4 years there. And even in that time, Europe hasn't really prepared. Preparation has been slow, and everyone had hopes that we'll somehow reach an agreement, find some option. Even now, we constantly hear statements, like the one from the G7 meeting in Canada, about how to force Putin to sit down at the negotiating table. This is a continuation of this nonsense. Putin cannot negotiate. That is clear. The war today. We can call it the exact algorithm of power, which keeps Putin at the top. The entire Russian reality today is saturated with war. By the way, I recommend watching a film online. It's currently being shown in America. It was even nominated for an Oscar, the documentary film Mr. Nobody Against Putin. It's very interesting. I met the person who filmed it. He is from the Russian province, the city of Karabakh, Chelyabinsk region. He was a teacher, and he was filming, he was a teacher organizer. And for 2 years he filmed this transformation of this school in this small industrial town with 10,000 people. And you just need to see what is happening, how it is changing. There is propaganda in schools. You look at this and understand that this process only moves in one direction. The population is being processed, and it seems to be on an ascending scale. You just need to understand that this has become a reality today. The war will continue as long as Putin has resources to do so. There are no other options. Putin is a war. We need to understand it. Many politicians in the West have already understood this, but again they are afraid to say it, because if this is a war, then it is necessary to destroy this regime. And the destruction of this regime is possible only in one case, when the situation in Russia becomes critical, when a significant part of the population understands that the imperial idea is simply dead. And nothing else, except for the Ukrainian flag raised in Sevastopol, can make people think so. I have been talking about this almost regularly, even for more than 4 years, because I started talking about it before Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But again, that would require a fundamental change in the entire foreign and domestic policy concept of the Western world, especially with President Donald Trump in Washington. And with the political impotence of European bureaucracy, which can't even resolve the issue of Vladimir Putin's frozen funds being in Europe. Even this issue is still not resolved, because there are norms. Yes, I understand, there are norms, of course. You can't break your own rules. But war in general is a thing in which all the rules of peacetime are cancelled, because this is a war, and you were attacked. But again, we need to save this. Let's put it this way. We need to save this peacetime entourage, because Europe continues to trade and maintain relations with other countries of this totalitarian anti-democratic bloc. There is China, and Saudi Arabia is there. Again, there is in fact an attempt to isolate the war in Ukraine and Vladimir Putin's aggression from other international factors, refusing to recognize that we are dealing with a large geopolitical board where a war is being fought. And this is the war between two worlds, the world of freedom and the world of tyranny.
The American president has said several times that he was counting on a faster end to the war, because he has good relations with Putin. I'll quote, "I thought it would be easy." Garry, is there a threat that Donald Trump will agree to Putin's conditions now, in order to end this war or pause there? Or what could be his deal? It's just that now it seems that Trump, on the one hand, gives Putin time to capture Donbass or at least Pokrovsk, in order to then demand that Ukraine withdraw its troops from the region. And on the other hand, he agrees that sanctions are needed, announces sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft. How should we understand it?
So, it means that we need to look at actions and the real consequences of actions and words. Trump, of course, would give everything to Putin. But the problem is that he also has phase limitations. After all, he does not live in a vacuum, and he, of course, would be ready to agree to many of Putin's demands. But it is obvious that President Vladimir Putin's demands for the actual elimination of the entire defensive line of fortification in Donbass are unacceptable. And even in the case if the city of Pokrovsk falls, which, unfortunately, is quite like inevitable, that will not affect the next lines of Ukrainian fortifications. No one will surrender them, because that would be suicide. And it is quite obvious that Vladimir Putin would use these territorial acquisitions to build a new bridgehead for an attack on Kiev. But as for the oil sanctions, everything is not so simple here. Of course, Trump has some interests of his own, but, by and large, this is still not a cardinal issue that solves everything, all the problems related to Russian oil exports at once. Yes, he's gradually pressing, but that's a long story again. I could go into detail about this, but it's clear that if the Americans and Europeans wanted to close the issue, they would. And after all, there are these straits, two Danish straits, through which Russian ships sail, this so-called shadow tanker fleet, and they could be closed. All that is needed is political will. Europe has already adopted 19 sanctions packages. Think about it for a second, 19. What does it mean? This means everything is gradual. So, they took a step here and there. So there was no feeling that it was necessary to do something abrupt. And trade through third countries continues. So it is clear that everything is moving in the right direction. But the speed of progress in the right direction is the speed of a turtle, not the speed of a cheetah. That is not the speed of a hare. In principle, this is such a turtle's movement in the right direction. That is why Putin is able to continue the war, especially since China is with him. And with Chinese help, the war can go on for a long time, and Donald Trump will not do anything against China. We see how he immediately begins to negotiate there. So President Donald Trump, like any person of such a type, when he meets force, he retreats. And Xi Jinping was not going to make any concessions to him. Therefore, in general, I wouldn't expect Trump to somehow magically solve everything there. In fact, Europe has a much greater opportunity to do this if Europe finally gathers its strength. I say again, there is Putin's money here. This is an important issue. And Europe can cause much more economic damage if it understands that this is a war. And the war will eventually come to them. I won't presume to give any precise timeframes, but it is absolutely clear that President Vladimir Putin has already violated the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's airspace many times, and has repeatedly, without any consequences, violated NATO's maritime borders. We should remember, this Biden's boast. We will defend every single square inch of NATO territory.
Sure.
Whatever Biden said, Trump said. It means nothing to Putin. We know that in the air and at the sea nothing happened. Now the question of the ground operation remains. This, of course, is more difficult, because it is harder to hide, and the appearance of Russian troops or some kind of these little green men. From Putin's traditional provocative menu, it will not be possible to hide it. But if we consider that Putin's goal is not even to capture the territory of some Baltic country, for example, it is unlikely, because this requires a large army, and in the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine, this is unlikely, this is almost unbelievable. Although it must be understood that if a truce is established in Ukraine for some time, not peace, the war cannot end. It cannot end as long as Putin is in power. This is kind of an axiom. Maybe some kind of truce is also extremely unlikely. By the way, I spoke about this a year ago, that there is very little hope that the war will somehow come to an end while Putin is sitting in the Kremlin. Now I think that there is simply no hope. So, the release of some troops in the event of a truce means that they will go elsewhere, and these more than million sadists and murderers who can do nothing but kill, and they are already crazy people, Putin will never allow them to return to Russia. This cannot be allowed. The appearance of such a number of armed people in a country that is really in such organizational and political chaos, in a country where the right of ownership is confirmed only by force, and, of course, no one can allow a change in such a balance of power. That is why Putin will always look for the possibility of using these armed forces for some further operations. But now with the fact that the war in Ukraine continues, Putin's army is stuck there, and, of course, Putin does not have any resources for full-scale aggression against Latvia or Estonia, for example. But he has enough resources to carry out such a limited operation. And this isn't even a full-scale invasion. It's just provocative actions in the border zone. For example, in the Narva area or in the Daugavpils area, there are large Russian-speaking cities nearby, not far from the border, and in order to establish that NATO is not implementing Article 5. And, unfortunately, I don't doubt it. I hope I'm wrong, of course, but I suspect that President Vladimir Putin sees the situation in a similar way. And the provocative actions, the sudden appearance of, as they say, 500,000 people who cross the border and seize a small piece of sovereign territory, I think, will cause total panic throughout NATO, because, of course, maybe the Latvians and Estonians will react there, and most likely, if someone arrives, perhaps the Finns will come to the aid of the Estonians. But NATO's reaction is extremely unlikely, it seems to me. This is the time for approval. In general, the fifth article of NATO, it is quite elastic. There is some kind of rubber element, so it can be stretched. It doesn't mean that as soon as someone is attacked, everyone immediately enters the war. There is a certain gap that Vladimir Putin will count on, because it is necessary to hold consultations, it is necessary to decide, and it is necessary to understand who will do what. And it will take time. And if it takes 2 or 3 days, then everyone will understand that there is no such organization as NATO anymore. In fact, there is none. NATO retired long time ago. When the 75th anniversary was celebrated in 2024, there was a shameful spectacle, as shaking President Joe Biden, the main NATO member there. So, they celebrated the 75th anniversary of the birth of the organization that defended Europe against the backdrop of the ongoing war in Europe. The paradox is that Ukraine is the only country now fighting the war NATO was created to prevent. After all, NATO was not created to fight terrorists in Afghanistan or in Iraq. North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created to protect free Europe from a Russian invasion. Back then, free Europe meant West Germany. Europe's border has expanded east of the Dnieper, where war rages. This is what NATO was created for, but the alliance is now avoiding its purpose, rendering it a mere piece of paper. The four-letter acronym is a kind of abbreviation that does not carry much content, because the North Atlantic Treaty Organization also includes Spain and Portugal. I was in Spain recently. Spain doesn't even want to hear about it. And moreover, I even understand the Spanish Prime Minister, he has elections next year. Why in the world should he raise the military budget from 2 to 5%? It seems that the Moors do not attack from Algeria. There are no real threats to Spain there. Yes, the war is going on there, but it is very far from Spain. And there is Portugal, even Spain, and France or Italy and France. So in general, this kind of North Atlantic Treaty Organization structure in its current form has outlived itself, especially given that America considers it, in principle, more of a burden. We either talk about creating a new military political alliance that can actually act, probably under Germany's leadership, which is problematic for Poland. Such an alliance would include countries directly in or near the war zone. Poland, the Baltic states, the Nordic countries, Romania, ideally, Hungary and Slovakia should be there, but we understand that there are other problems today. So Europe must prepare for, let's put it this way, a full-scale clash. And this requires not so much military as political measures, because there is Hungary, Slovakia. A certain unity of those countries that are close to this zone is required. And all this is with the fact that Putin is waging a hybrid war quite successfully. We had Orban, now Fico. There are problems with the Czechs. Babiš will now become the leader there. Putin is conducting very active subversive activities. Almost all European countries have pro-Putin parties, and strong pro-Putin parties, such as the Alternative for Germany, and it is the most popular party in Germany today. Therefore, any extraordinary elections in Germany will most likely bring to power this far-right party, which openly, as they say, supports Putin and, most likely, is on Putin's payroll. In France, the next elections will probably bring Marine Le Pen's party to power, another force sympathetic to Russia. So in general, we see that the general balance today is not in favor of the free world, because again there is no political leadership capable of resisting, or at least fixing the general policy of the West at the level of Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Reagan, Thatcher, Adenauer, de Gaulle. This leadership is not even close.
You said that in general Europe could do more than the United States of America. However, just before November 21st, the date when comprehensive sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft are set to become fully effective, Peskov and Lavrov started giving numerous interviews. And Peskov even appeared on the American television channel CNN. He complained that Russia began to lose too much money. He said, "We are now ready to talk to you about everything. About nuclear disarmament, about anything, just let's meet." Putin's assistant Ushakov also gave a comment. He admitted that at least some contacts are going on with Washington, but at the same time the United States is not going to change its decision regarding Russia. Let us listen and discuss.
Do we have any news on our relationship with the United States, or is there a pause?
I wouldn't call it a pause, but there is no such revolutionary news yet. However, there are ongoing contacts, and these contacts are actively held at various levels, with embassies in Washington and Moscow diligently working. So,
The embassies are open, but there was a question about real estate. It seems that at least this issue should have been discussed, but it haven't been, right?
yes, there are problems. Things aren't progressing as quickly as desired, but contacts are established.
Garry, why is Putin so maniacally seeking negotiations with Trump? Explain his strategy to us.
The strategy has always been based on finding the weak link. Trump is certainly the weak link. He is corrupt. It is no coincidence that negotiations with Putin were conducted not by Rubio, but by Witkoff, his confidant. Vladimir Putin is interested in deals, specifically in finding attractive options for President Donald Trump and his family that could potentially influence Trump toward Putin's desired direction on Ukraine. Again, Trump would really love to do this. And the fact that there are contacts, but everything is going slowly, as we have just heard, is due to the fact that Trump does not live in a vacuum. He would have given everything. Of course, Trump Tower in Moscow would have appeared already. Putin knows perfectly well how to buy Trump, but President Donald Trump has to take into account public opinion and the strong, unwavering support for Ukraine even among his most fervent, dedicated supporters, as well as within his own administration. Publicly everyone praises Trump, saying that he is so great, but the flattery has already become simply overflowing with regard to Trump. But, I think, beyond the visibility of the TV cameras, there are other conversations. And Trump is forced to maneuver. In fact, he is holding America back from using the most severe measures against President of Russia Vladimir Putin. Again, I mention tomahawks. In fact, it could quite possibly have a much stronger impact on Vladimir Putin. But he cannot enter into any agreements. It is interesting what Shoigu said about embassies. He says, embassies are working. A question, if Europe is preparing for war, the ambassadors could be recalled. There is no need to break off diplomatic relations, but it would still be possible to lower the level of relations. After all, it would be possible to somehow demonstrate that we are actually preparing for war with Russia. In fact, there are no actions that would confirm these words. On the one hand, we are preparing for war, and on the other hand, some kind of work is going on. Yes, we, of course, introduce visa restrictions, but Europe does not use its potential, in fact, its enormous potential, to increase pressure on Putin as much as possible. Not so much on Putin himself, but on the elite of Russian society in general, which is also quite sensitive to what is happening abroad.
We are again analyzing what is happening now in the Russian Federation. We see how often and almost every day Flamingo missiles, long-range Neptunes, Storm Shadow, Ukrainian drones fly into Russia. And warehouses, refineries, ports are on fire. Belgorod is without electricity, and there are huge losses in equipment and people at the front. Why are there no signs of this opposition activity in Russia? Is everyone happy with everything? Even if we talk about this elite, which you mentioned, how does all this affect them? Or, basically, are they silent because they are not allowed to say anything, since they know what might follow from Putin?
I don't think there is much enthusiasm for supporting the war. This film that I mentioned is from this province. In 2024, the last shots were taken there. This Mr. Nobody Against Putin, which was filmed by Pavel Telenkin, a teacher who is now, naturally, in the West. But for most Russian citizens, what can they do? Basically, that's just how life is now. Protest is not an easy thing in the conditions of a fascist dictatorship. You can't expect people to speak out. Germany in 1942, 1943, in general, although I think that the actual level of support for the government in Russia, ideological support, is, of course, much lower than it was in Germany during Hitler's time. I think there is no ideological support. There is a significant part of the population, I think about a third, that is, the bloodthirsty part, and we are at war. But the rest, I think, are just trying to sort of exist in this situation. By the way, one of the problems is that the West has done nothing to destroy the engineering and computer potential of Putin's military machine. I have spoken out on this topic many times, and Khodorkovsky, and I have also written to various Western authorities on this matter, saying that in order to weaken Putin's military potential, it is necessary, of course, to give engineers and computer specialists the opportunity to leave. And if the 500,000 people who could leave actually did, it would be serious damage, because someone still has to make the missiles, program things, draw all of it. And this is not the potential that Putin has, not unlimited, not large enough. So this is where one could really find the Achilles heel of Putin's regime. Unfortunately, everything is ignored. The visa issue is being discussed. I think that visas should all be shut down. During the war, visas are not given. Provide an opportunity for those ready to denounce Putin's regime. The war is criminal, the regime is illegitimate, Crimea is Ukraine's. You sign the statement, and you have the possibility to move to another place. This is part of a general plan that could perhaps change the mood in Russia. Let's not forget that more than 1 million people left in 2022. Then they had to go back because no one needed them. Putin uses this well. No one needs you, you'll end up working for me here anyway. So I wouldn't expect any public statements. There is another reason. You have just shown pictures that prove that the situation in Russia is deteriorating there. But this is not the picture that people see on TV. On Russian TV there are different pictures. Russia is moving forward. Yes, there are huge losses. But this is not at all a kind of red line for the Russian mentality. Yes, we are suffering losses, but we are moving forward. We will take Pokrovsk in some time. This is all a huge victory. So the situation at the front looks quite favorable from their point of view, from the point of view of the average person watching television. Given that Russia is waging war according to the propaganda concept. They are not at war with Ukraine. Ukraine is a puppet of the West. Russia is at war with NATO. NATO didn't start or want this war, but it's seen publicly as a war with NATO, so losses are necessary. Yes, we are fighting, we need to win, otherwise the country will perish. In this film that I've mentioned a few times, they actually show that children in school are already being taught that this is a war to survive, it's a question of Russia's survival. This means that we need to make sacrifices. And we are talking about a small town. Imagine a projection for the whole of Russia. In general, it seems that a critical mass of rejection has not yet arisen. In Russia, this arises only when it becomes obvious that the war is going badly. This is Russian history 200 years since the Napoleonic War. Any victory always means strengthening the regime and increasing the reaction. Any defeat is the beginning of change, social, political, even revolutionary. It has always been like this, and nothing has changed now. Therefore, if we want changes in Russia, Ukraine must receive all the necessary weapons, all the necessary resources to defeat Putin's army as soon as possible. It would be necessary, of course, to resort to more extreme measures. But to imagine Western pilots flying Western aircraft, or even opening the way for volunteers from Western armies to join, is pure fantasy. But we must do everything necessary to clearly change this trend. Not just one missile landing somewhere, missiles would really have to be flying to Moscow and St. Petersburg.
Yes.
It is clear that the main air defense forces are located there, but the West has enough resources. Providing these resources to Ukraine might have altered Russian perceptions of the war.
That's right, the West has enough resources, and we always say, give us missiles, and we will destroy Putin's military machine. This is how it works. We see the impact of strikes on oil refineries and military warehouses. But even Trump, who seemed to promise us tomahawks, then suddenly backed down and said, Putin is threatening me with nuclear weapons, nuclear tests, and so on. Is there still a fear of this nuclear escalation, or what is stopping them?
Nuclear escalation is such a classic Putin horror story. I have said many times that the likelihood of nuclear escalation is minimal. There is always some probability, but it tends to zero. There are many factors here. Some of them are domestically Russian. The Putin regime, after all, is based on the kind of corrupt benefits for officials, whether in the army, the FSB, or the bureaucracy. And no one there has ever been recorded to have a desire for suicide. But the most important argument, in my opinion, which makes the use of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, in this war practically impossible is China's position. In my opinion, today Putin is completely dependent on China. Xi Jinping is really in charge of the whole situation. And for China, the use of tactical nuclear weapons by Russia is absolutely unacceptable for a very simple reason. As soon as, let's imagine, Putin presses the button, or, more precisely, he must give the command, and everything works, which I am not very sure about. But let's imagine, everything worked out. Putin said, press the buttons. They launched a missile, a tactical nuclear weapon, somewhere in the direction of Ukraine. Besides, everything is changing, and the NATO situation is changing too. But the most important thing is something else. Once nuclear weapons are used, restrictions on other countries getting them vanish, though they avoid it as too risky. No one wants nuclear escalation. Which countries, from Beijing's perspective, are the most dangerous and will immediately acquire nuclear weapons? First of all, Japan. It's a question of a year, or maybe 6 months. The Japanese have enough potential. South Korea, Taiwan definitely, of course. Why does Xi Jinping need this? A nuclear Japan, which will also build an imperial navy, changes all the balances. I'm not even talking about Germany becoming nuclear. This is a chain reaction around the world. Why does Xi Jinping need this? He is satisfied with the war that is going on now. Let Putin waste resources and send Russian soldiers into the fires of war. Naturally, there are very large losses of population, of the male population, in the Far East and Eastern Siberia, those regions that China is interested in. And from China's point of view, this is a territory for development, because few people remember this now, but in fact, in China it is already recorded, and China regularly reminds us of this, that before 1860, all the territories of today's Russia from Vladivostok to Lake Baikal were China. China had 1.5 million square kilometers, 2.5 Ukraines in terms of territory. Not a piece of land in the Pokrovsk area or somewhere else, but 2.5 of Ukraine's territory. This was China that Russia took from at the time, taking advantage of China's weakness, just like all other large imperial countries. Changing the border that was fixed in the 17th century between the two countries. And today China is very actively developing it. Vladivostok is no longer on Chinese maps. There is Haishanwei, where the Chinese customs office operates. And considering the population imbalance and economic power imbalance, there's no doubt that these territories seem like a much more appealing target for Xi Jinping's expansion than this rocky island called Taiwan, armed with missiles, potentially backed by the US, with drones and technology. Therefore, China will not allow Putin to move the war to the nuclear stage. Putin is completely dependent on China now. I really can't imagine him making a move without getting Beijing's approval.
Garry, finally, I want to discuss with you the Rebus-style cover of The Economist for 2026, which features Volodymyr Zelensky in military uniform, holding binoculars. The abundance of tanks, missiles, submarines, drones is noticeable. The magazine predicts the continuation, and possibly the escalation of military conflicts in the world. Further trade wars are also expected. You can notice a large number of pills and syringes. And in addition, journalists write that weight loss drugs similar to Ozempic will be released. There are also many drones and robots. Most likely, development, robotization. What did you see on this cover and what do you think awaits us in 2026?
The cover is quite objective. The war will continue because it is a war between two concepts of the development of the world. Unfortunately, so far, the free world hasn't really come out with a clear understanding of how to counter this Putin-driven, or rather, not even Putin-driven, but general, trend that has been developing in the world recently. So we shouldn't expect any magical solution to these problems. Accordingly, the continuation of the war. Yes, trade wars are also part of general chaos. Chaos is also connected to the fact that after the end of the Cold War, the world did not find, we are talking about the free world, which was supposed to dictate the terms, America first and foremost, an algorithm for a new existence. Structures such as the UN, which are completely inadequate to today's requirements, remain dominant. Today, this organization has become simply a platform for dictators, and, of course, in no way even corresponds to its official goals. And against this background, a painful formation of a new reality is taking place. A new reality is always born in wars. Unfortunately, humanity is tragically made this way. So these wars will continue until the world system enters some kind of stable, balanced phase. But until the most important subject of this entire structure is eliminated, and that is Putin's Russia, Imperial Russia, there will be no order. There is no point in expecting the system to come into equilibrium while there is a regime that relies on a centuries-old imperial tradition and has made war. And a real hot war, the basis, the core of its existence. Therefore, the war will continue. But I really hope that it will end in 2026, because the West will finally use its military economic potential to help Ukraine complete it. Or maybe Putin will cross all the red lines, and the West will be forced to get involved in the war. It's going to be? This is not a parade, it's a war. Most likely, it will still bring additional destruction, additional tragedies that will extend beyond Ukraine's borders. But unfortunately, this is inevitable, because the Putin regime must be eliminated, and along with it, the imperial idea, the Russian imperial idea, which for many years, if not decades or centuries, has been one of the global factors behind this instability, must be buried as well.
Garry, thank you very much for an interesting conversation, for finding time for our broadcast. I wish you a good day. Friends, Garry Kasparov was with us today. Write your comments and tell us what you think about all the topics we discussed today. And, of course, indicate from which country, which city you are watching us. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you and see you next time.